Hello, and thank you for having me at the Acronis Global Cyber Summit 2020. I'm very honored to be here with you guys today, and although I cannot really be here, believe me, I'm there in spirit. I'm presenting to you from Silicon Valley, where I have been for quite a while, almost a quarter century. And what I wanted to do with you today is to share an experience I've had over the last 10 plus years. And it's all about disruption, right? We live in a very complex world, and nothing is ever getting better in terms of complexity. And therefore, also the types of risks and the opportunities that come with that. To become a leader in such a turbulent time, it takes a number of things, not just courage, which is very important, but also beliefs and a vision. And no better way to tell that kind of story than to tell the story of my last 10 years at Palo Alto Networks, but also weave that into the Acronis story, which is a very similar story in terms of disruption and beliefs. So with that, let me first spend a little bit of time introducing myself and then go into the content. I've been somebody who has always believed that selling boring things to what ultimately turns out to be boring use cases operated by boring people, with all respect to you, of course, is fun. And I enjoy it. But to do that, right, you have to fight illusions and what I sometimes call fake wisdom. Right? And that all drives to change. And change is hard because people naturally oppose against change. They find it hard. They have many reasons not to want it. And it's very human not to want it. But to do that well, in your mind, you have to operate as a disruptor, because then the outcomes will be very, very different. And so I'll talk about that as well. So I've been here in Silicon Valley for almost 25 years. And in those times, you can only imagine the rate of change that I've been able to witness firsthand, whether that was in data management or infrastructure or operations or security or storage, you name it. Things that were unfathomable 25 years ago have become possible. Interestingly enough, there were things 25 years ago that existed, ideas, algorithms, all kinds of technology, but that couldn't be realized because there was just no compute power or no storage large enough or fast enough to do it. Today we can. Yet, if you think about the fundamental disruptions that have occurred, they all have to do with what we are doing, what purpose we're doing it for, and very importantly, how we're doing it. And, in many ways, security, which is an area of expertise for me, has been in that realm. 15 years ago, we had a very different perception of what security had to be. And we also thought it was something very different then than it is now. So my experience has been that I didn't come from engineering. I didn't come from a commercial background. I studied economics and mathematics. And it turns out that mathematics, as many people will argue and maintain, is a very good foundation for many things. Many IT products have been founded on mathematical principles. And it turns out that data and mathematics combined allow you to do amazing things. And that's part of the disruption that we see now. We don't have to guess at things. We can learn things. We can make things better because we observe, we analyze, and we improve constantly. So I've done that for a long time at Palo Alto Networks. I've retired from the company. I've been doing that for a long time as a member of the board at Acronis, including now its chairman, because I fundamentally believe in the mission that Acronis has. And I'm now doing it as an executive in residence at Battery Ventures, which is a global venture firm investing very heavily in infrastructure technology. So let me tell you about the journey. Now let me tell you the industry that I walked into about 15 years ago called security. Not many industries will openly admit failure, but here's one that did in a very blatant way. So one of the very first people I heard speak right, said on stage in front of thousands of people that there are only two types of companies: those that have been hacked and those that don't know that they've been hacked. Now, imagine, right, that being the core, right, of the problem in your industry, right, i.e., everything has failed. And more importantly, we as an industry have failed you, our consumers, our customers. Right? Not a good thing. At the same time, people were saying, by now, 2020, prevention is futile. What does that mean? So that means that we have to accept defeat. Now imagine, right? Imagine that you run a business and you operate an airline. And the CEO of the airline would say, you know what, there's only two types of companies, right? Or airlines or planes, right? Those that have fallen from the sky and those that, well, will soon fall, or it's just not going to work, right? It will be unacceptable. So why is security so different? Right? What mindset, right, does that prevail? Well, turns out that these folks saying this were actually considered to be leaders in their industry. Right? John Chambers, right, the head of Cisco, and Neil McDonald, a lead analyst at Gartner. So why is that? Well, that's because they also heard from their customers and the folks that they interacted with that maybe wasn't a problem. Right? 15 years ago, did we know about security problems? Maybe not. Maybe we did. But when I walked into this industry and I would sit down with businesses, right, typically this is what I would see. Right? And if you recognize this picture, it's a picture from a movie, National Treasure, right, when they finally find the treasure, right, locked up, right, underneath Washington, D.C. Or was it perhaps another city? I leave that to you. Right? Go watch the movie. Right? It's fun. But here's the thing. Right? When I watched, right, what was below the surface, right, there was a true treasure. Lots of things. Right? Many, many things that we believe are valuable. What our customers, and back then what companies were saying is, well, there's nothing really here. What I have cannot be of interest, right, to anybody. So that's not very valuable. You would say, well, okay, maybe, right? Maybe it's not valuable to you, right? Although clearly this is valuable, but there's always value there for attackers, right? So don't believe that because you don't see the value of what you manage, the information, the intellectual property, right, whatever that may be, right, isn't valuable, because it is. This picture can be taken in two ways. You can say, well, oh, poor victims, right? But it also shows the innovation that is happening, right, and the veracity of everything that is going on versus the attitude of many organizations saying it may not be that important to me. I may not be so vulnerable to this. Right? What this is showing is that there is significant innovation, but also collaboration going on, right, on the side of the attackers. Right? They cannot do this because one individual is good. They can only do this because they work together and they build a very resilient approach, right, to the problems that they're trying to cause, but also to the amount of technology they're going to use to make this happen. Right? And so they embraced the cloud a lot faster than most businesses did. They embraced agility and collaborative R&D a lot earlier than most organizations did. So while we were trying to figure things out as businesses, right, the other side wasn't trying to figure it out. They just did it. Right? And that meant, right, that more and more organizations, right, became more and more vulnerable. So the truth, though, is don't take this information as we've lost. Right? It just means that we have to step up our game. And that's not just technology. That's also in policy. That's in collaboration. That's in all aspects of life. Right? We need to figure out how we're going to do this. Now, while things are changing fast, it also turns out that nothing actually disappears. Right? So this very insightful diagram shows you that if you look at top 8 techniques that are being used, right, in attacks, right, over the last 5 years, right, none of them have gone away. Right? They've lived, right, and they shapeshift. Right? So malware right, specifically ransomware, right, continues to be very, very prevalent. Malware, right, password dumpers continues to be very, very important. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things go away. It's kind of a Formula One race. Right? It's not always the same guys that win. Well, sometimes it is, but that shouldn't be the case. Right? But in the race that is called, right, the arms race in cyber, many things stay the same. And it's important, right, that we realize that you have to embrace not only the latest technique, right? You have to make yourself resilient against all techniques and against all styles. And this is something that wasn't supposed to happen. But it turns out, right, that this also demonstrates, right, how much behind businesses are in embracing cyber, which, by the way, makes a great opportunity. Right? It tells you, the operators in the room, that you have to do something. It also tells you, the folks that cater, right, to end customers, that there is a significant opportunity to do a better job. Right? And that continues to be the name of the game in cyber. Right? It's never going to be a checkmate, right, on the attacker or the defendant. Right? It's always going to be a cat and mouse race where both parties, right, get better and better at what they do, but with a belief, right? I believe that much of this can be prevented, much of it, right? Because the outcome of building it that way, right, will show that those results can be attainable. This picture, right, the hacker, right, the matrix, the hoodie, right? Why do I show this picture? Well, it's because the cybersecurity industry, and I don't know why, wants you to believe that this is the problem maker. Well, and by the way, this is the first picture that when I searched for hacker on Google showed up. Right? This is what the world believes. Right? Even when you look at much of cybersecurity businesses today and services today, this is what they want you to believe, right, is the problem. A human, right, on a computer, fingers on the keyboard, trying to do something very specific to you. Right? Well, if that were true, right, it would actually be very easy to guard yourself against that type of threat, right? Because that's not asymmetrical. That's not at all asymmetrical. In fact, that is very symmetrical, because I can put a human against a human and I'd be fine. But that's not the case. The case is actually this. The enemy, right, is a set of robots, right, that have learned the game, and it doesn't really matter how they learned the game, but they learned the game, right, and now they're playing, in this case, table tennis against you. So guess what your chances are of winning here? None. Right? You have no chance of winning. And by the way, I'm good friends with somebody who built this computer system and this robotic system, and the irony of this is the robots never were taught the game of table tennis. Much like AlphaGo, what was the Google experiment, was never taught the game of Go. It observed, it learned, it analyzed, and then it improved. And that cycle went on and on and on and on. And so this is asymmetrical warfare. Right? And this is the reason why you cannot think of this problem as a human problem. Right? You have to think about this as a automation problem, right, where your friend is automation. Your friend is a system that is totally connected, completely coordinated, and very importantly, right, has the characteristics, right, of the very enemy that you're up against. Right? This was a tough one because a lot of folks initially would tell us, I get it now, right? But I'm actually good at what I do. Right? I know what to do, right? So you, cybersecurity industry, just give me more tools, right? And I'm actually good at what I do because, look, I haven't been hacked, right? I'm still fine. I'm not that interesting, so I'm okay. And this is where still a lot of companies are. They're in a situation where they have maybe embraced the challenge, they've maybe embraced the problem, but they haven't really embraced, right, the way that you operate this. It turns out, right, and I've now seen thousands of companies, right, in the last 10 plus years that make an attempt at being good at cybersecurity. And they all tell me the exact same thing. Right? They all tell me that while they are supposed to feel at ease, they're telling me four things all the time. Too many vendors, so I am becoming my own systems integrator, and it doesn't work. And believe me, that's not because they are not good at doing it. It's because the products they're trying to integrate were never built to work together. So guess what? It isn't going to work. Right? Too many tools. I don't know what to use. Do I use a hammer? Do I use a screwdriver? I don't know what tool fits the problem anymore. Right? And by the way, there's probably not one of them. There's many of them. Right? There are very many philosophies even, right? Defense in depth, right? That says, well, it's actually a good thing because 2 is better than 1 and 3 is better than 2, so you should have more of these things. And I disagree. The math doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter how many vendors you have or how many tools you have. It really matters what techniques these tools bring against the techniques that the attackers are using. And then what we hear all the time is there's just too many alerts. And that is because at the end of the day, as it turns out in the cybersecurity industry, very few cybersecurity products actually stop a threat. They've all been built on the philosophy, right, that was essentially told us by the likes of Gartner, that it is more important, right, to detect things than to prevent things. So give up on prevention. Well, what that means is we just put many, many probes out there that warn us about a million things, and then we have to kind of figure out through processes and maybe technology and probably both, right, what is real, what is not, what is a priority, what is not. And an entire industry has started to emerge just at managing the avalanche of these alerts. Now, here's the sad reality. Right? If you turn the clock back a week ago, a month ago, right, a year ago, and you look at all of the great breaches and all of the challenges we've had in the industry, right, what we've observed is that every one of the circumstances that led to the eventual breach were known, right, in the systems that were collecting alerts. All of them. So all of the indicators of compromise were already collected. But because you can't see the forest from the trees, you cannot operate a system, right, that assumes that somehow humans are going to do triage, right, on the alerts or technology. You have to have technology in place that sits in line, right, and does it. You cannot rely on too much manual labor. And even if you are relying on manual labor, you probably can never ramp enough power. Right? If you're up against highly programmed robots, right, how many folks do you think you can have on the other side of the table playing ping pong? Well, 2, and they get in their way. 3, right, and nobody will be able to even swing the bat because one can be left-handed, one can be right-handed. But what is the guy in the middle going to do? Right? What hand is he going to play? So it doesn't scale that way. Right? You can only scale, right, in the same way that the attackers are scaling, right, which is automation, right, and analytics. So, by the way, all of this, right, is not just a matter of it gets too expensive, right, and I cannot do it. It even turns out that misconfiguration of all this stuff is a rampant issue. So you believe you have the tools, you believe you have the techniques, you believe you have the vendors that you need, but then do you really understand, right, how to tie it all together, how to configure it in a consistent way such that you are protected? And the answer is no. It really doesn't work that way. It really doesn't get any better by adding more technology. So if this is the problem, right, what are you going to do about it? Right? What are you going to now do now that you know that you are a victim, or you will be a victim, or there's a high likelihood of you being a victim? You're no different than anybody else. Right? You understand, right, what the game is and who your friends and enemies are. So what are you going to do? Are you going to kind of say, well, my first choice is I just put some lipstick on the pig, right? I'm going to buy yet another product, right? I'm going to kind of figure it out, right? Yeah, it doesn't look pretty, but I patch it up here a little bit and I make a few changes here, and maybe I can live another week, right, before I become bacon, so to speak. I don't think that's a good choice. I don't think that choice should ever be considered. Right? The choice has to be much more dramatic. And it's companies like Acronis, right, that say, listen, how you think about the supply chain, right, of threat, how you think about the automation of defense, how you think about the way you operate such a system, right, has to be different. So it's not putting lipstick on a pig, right? It is a fundamental redesign of the process, right? No stone left unturned when it comes to disruption, right? And Acronis is in good company here, right? I've seen more than one company do this, not only in cyber, but in their industries, right? Disruptive innovation is not the same as just taking the old, right, and making it slightly better, right? And one of the things that is so remarkable is that when you see it, you recognize it because it's so different from what you saw. Finally, I'm going to talk about what I would call the philosophy behind things. Right? Are they still the same? Do we still think about the same things, or do we also change the philosophy behind it? Right? Because operationally, integration and completeness and so forth are very important. But what do we believe in? Right? Do we believe in prevention? Do we believe in the defense in depth? Or are there other beliefs that we have? And I'm going to go a little bit more into what the belief was behind starting Palo Alto Networks and the belief, right, of what we had to do to not only have a great technology, but also have a very audacious way of thinking about the problem. So rolling the clock back again 15 years ago, right, it was not uncommon to walk into an enterprise, and I'll take the example of Macy's, right, a very famous retail chain here in the US. When one would walk into the Macy's head office in San Francisco 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right, and even not so long ago, the employees were not allowed to be on the public internet. They were proxied, they were heavily filtered, right, and they couldn't engage, right, with the very folks that would come to their store because it was deemed a risk, since the applications they were using, the sites they were going to, were not controllable by IT. Or a very famous global banker, Morgan Stanley, who at the time they were doing our IPO at Palo Alto Networks, they were also doing the Facebook IPO. And guess what? In their corporate offices on Sand Hill Road, in Menlo Park, or Palo Alto, same thing, they couldn't go to Facebook because it was deemed a risk, both a cyber risk and a productivity risk. So you think about those cases, and by the way, that continues to be very pervasive. Right? Security was of the negative kind. You cannot bring your own computer. You cannot use our systems from home. You cannot go to social media. You cannot, and the list would go on and on. Right? I believe that first and foremost, right, the role of security is to have a positive enforcement capability on the infrastructure. It's very important that security, right, says, yeah, I know what to do here. Right? I know what to do, so I can strike a balance between risk and reward. Right? Not everything is wholesale bad or wholesale good, but I understand, right, what needs to be done. I understand that I need to be able to build policies that aren't just block this because of that, but are of the type that is, by the way, very hard to do, of an allow but. Saying, yes, you can use this capability, you can use this technology, you can create this interaction, but I'm going to make sure that I understand what you're doing. And it's very different if you try to export proprietary data than to talk about something commercial with an end customer. It's very different when you're working on a project with an external collaborator, right, than sharing intellectual property that you shouldn't. But that means that the policy that you're going to enforce is fundamentally a positive one. Yes, you can do these things, but I'm still going to make sure, right, that you don't do anything silly. Right? And this goes back to operator error, right, or insider threat, or whatever the threat may be, but also to the outside. Right? I cannot pull the cord. Right? That's impossible. So what's the alternative? Try to block everything. that's not realistic either, because you don't know 99% of what is going on. But to have technology that can prevent these issues from happening is critical. Now, for the security folks in the audience, let me tell you, when I walked into this industry, I was met by folks who thought of themselves as sort of a James Bond, but more like Dr. No. Yes, I'm very smart. I'm a spy. I'm trying to get things done. But in the end, I still have to say no all the time. No, you cannot go to Facebook. No, you cannot use Box. No, you cannot use a cloud backup system. You cannot use any of this because I can control it. And furthermore, I have no idea what that operator is going to do with this service, with this application. So no, just don't do it. Roll the clock forward. I believe that the cybersecurity industry continues to be bond, because we need to be able to be very smart about the adversary, outdo him, outflank him, outsmart him all the time. But more with the mentality of saying, never say never again. You don't want to say, no, it won't happen to me, but also, no, you cannot do that. I think it's very important that you believe in that enabling part of cybersecurity. Because most folks will tell you, well, if you're going to tell me that I cannot do these things, then I don't know that I want that, on the business side, And for a long time, the business and the security teams were at odds. It doesn't have to be that way. The same is true, by the way, for how we do things. I fundamentally believe, and it was the founding principle of Palo Alto Networks, that there should be a network effect, meaning we're going to have to work together, and we have to do it really well, and we're going to observe across hundreds, thousands of organizations to get this right? Because there only has to be one prime victim or primary victim, a patient zero, as we call it. Everybody else needs to benefit from the fact that there only has to be one, and it can immediately roll out all of the preventative measures through this network to protect everybody. Now, that means, by the way, that the system cannot live there where it used to live. It cannot live on premises. It cannot live behind corporate firewalls and on proprietary systems. It needs to be a communal system. And that's a tough belief, because we're not used to it. We've seen it, how it works with SaaS applications, but that actually was more a convenience. This cyber issue turns out you cannot do it properly if you don't create a network effect, and very importantly, if it isn't data and science driven. It's not humans against humans. You cannot build it on that way. It's completely based on data that you collect through a network, science you apply to the data, and then science you apply to the algorithm through algorithms on the data. And I think it's critical that you understand this, and it's critical that you, when you choose your vendor, the one you're going to work with, the one you're going to implement, the one you're going to represent, that those are core characteristics, because at the end, that will drive a very different outcome, an outcome that is highly automated, where the system doesn't depend on how many humans you apply or how many SOC engineers you're able to hire, if you even can. It is a system of automation. Now, automation requires accuracy, so it's very important, of course, that we build it accurately. It also requires it to be cloud delivered. In other words, you cannot do this as something you implement yourself. It's got to be done through specialists that deliver this anywhere, from anywhere, in a highly structured manner. And I think that's different from what we typically think about cybersecurity. It's not an art form that every company has to invent, every company has to understand. This is becoming a cloud-delivered service, highly automated, very networked, that builds a much better system that can then deliver what I would call a correctly operating system. That system is delivered as a service. It's not something you do yourself, because it turns out 15, 25 years of people operating cybersecurity themselves, we're just not good at this. And this is the ultimate proof of self-awareness, admitting that despite everything, we've not been very good at this. And so building it the right way makes the system the right system and gets us into a position where we can build proper defense. And then in the end, it turns out, and this is somewhat of a side benefit, that it actually is much more economical to do this as well. Right? It turns out that if you do it from the cloud and if it's automated and driven by science and networked, right, then it turns out to be much more economical than trying to do it yourself with many tools from many vendors that you're trying to make work together, that you're trying to manage the alerts of, right, and just applying more and more labor, right, which not only doesn't work, right, but also is unaffordable to most. So it makes cyber and proper cyber defense, preventative defense, actually attainable and available to all. Very different outcomes, right? And so this picture is one I've used for a long time, right? It shows to me, this is kind of my picture that I show about what makes, for example, cloud security so different these days, right? We believe you were pursued by bees and all kinds of horrible insects, right? But if you do it right, you're going to be in a very different state of mind, right? You're going to have it done in a very different way. And think about cybersecurity that way, right? It's not something that you cannot attain because it's complicated. It's not something you can avoid because you think you're not a potential victim. It's there. And if you do it that way, right, you can build very, very different outcomes. Now, last thing I want to say about this before I wrap up. I was very fortunate to have done that at Palo Alto Networks, where we ended up, right, becoming a public company, and not just any public company in cyber, but effectively the largest cybersecurity company in revenue, right, in 15 years. Right? That is an amazing outcome. And it was mostly because, yes, our technology was great, but behind it was also a strong belief that if you disrupt the beliefs and the wisdom, right, and the way that people think about cybersecurity, it is important. I, as somebody who has tracked Acronis for a long time, believe that Acronis is in that position as well. It has a very disruptive way of thinking about cybersecurity. It has an amazing team of very smart individuals who also believe in this very different approach. So with that, I wish you a wonderful conference. And I'm very glad to take questions later on and hopefully see you when we come out of this pandemic and this situation, and next time do this in person. Thank you very much. And Sergey, over to you.